several wars.
Great letters saying women are supposed to be tertiary.
Look who's here!
Unless you know for sure what's directly said by I'll accept it.
Right.
You're brave to have been arrested.
Okay.
Good.
Flyers in front of the White House was in early 1965 against the war in Vietnam. At that time, I was employed by the State Department, and so I was very nervous about if one of my co-workers would pass by and see me. 5 years later, I was still protesting America's wars. I was no longer at the State Department, but there was Cambodia and Laos to protest, Nicaragua and El Salvador. Then Panama became the great threat to humanity, so we had to bomb them without mercy. Followed by the first war against Iraq, and then followed by the 78-day bombing of the former Yugoslavia, and then Iraq again, and I've skipped a few. But I think I hold the record for most times picketing the White House by a right-handed batter. The secret to understanding U.S. foreign policy is that there's no secret. Principally, one must come to the realization that the United States wants to dominate the world, for which it is prepared to use any means necessary. And once you understand that basic principle, a lot of the confusion and contradiction and ambiguity surrounding U.S. foreign policy fades away. Things become much clearer once you understand that it's world domination that we're after. Now, since World War II, to express this idea numerically, since World War II, and this is partly mentioned by Paul just now, he stole my lines. Since World War II, the U.S. has attempted to overthrow more than 50 foreign governments, most of which had been democratically elected. We have grossly interfered in elections all over the world in at least 30 countries. We have attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. We have dropped bombs on more than 30 countries, and we have attempted to suppress a populist or a nationalist movement in more than 20 countries. All of this, plus the wars I just mentioned, constitute a huge amount of violence. Violence, along with economic crisis and environmental dangers, are the three main problems facing our world today. And sad to say, our dear country is the main culprit in all three. When it comes to violence, we have to remember we are the most warlike. Our wars are unending and cover large areas, all of Southeast Asia, all of the Middle East. And our drone attacks spread it even farther. Our military bases spread it even farther than that. Our wars create armies of refugees, and there is a connection between our wars and the expansion of our bases. Here's how it works. Following its bombing of Iraq in 1991, the United States wound up with the military bases in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. Following its bombing in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the United States wound up with military bases in Kosovo, Albania, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Hungary, Bosnia, and Croatia. Following its bombing of Afghanistan in 2001 and 2, the U.S. wound up with bases in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Yemen, and Djibouti. This is not very subtle foreign policy. And that's the way the empire grows, a base in every region, ready to be mobilized to put down any threat to imperial rule. 68 years after World War II ended, the U.S. still has major bases in Germany and Japan. 60 years after the end of the Korean War, we still have tens of thousands of servicemen stationed in South Korea. So that's the violence problem. Secondly, the economic. The world is still suffering terribly from the economic meltdown of 2007 and 8. A crisis created by American stockbrokers and banks and insurance companies, credit rating agencies, hedge funds, and other members of the American financial mafia, who just played all kinds of games with our money, issuing mortgages to anyone who came along, creating all kinds of useless pieces of paper, which we now call toxic assets, with no regard for the consequences, getting rich while the bubble grew until it burst here and there, and in the US and in Asia and in Europe. Why does Obama not seek to punish the American financial mafia as much as he seeks to punish Julian Assange and Manning and Edward Snowden? Thirdly, the environmental crisis. We're second to China in total emissions, but we're first in per capita emissions. And there's no institution in the world which is responsible for more emissions of CO2 than our military. Our Humvees and our tanks and our airplanes and our helicopters, they add up to freak weather, which is almost becoming the norm. Why does Barack Obama not pursue the battle against climate change with the same intensity he pursues war? Why does he attend international climate conferences more intent upon sabotaging those conferences than doing anything to improve the climate? In both cases, the economic and the environment, the president is putting the corporations and their interests well before anything else. No amount of fines is going to scare off the corporate leaders from doing what they do. Only spending some hard time in a cell block with a guy who's 6'5" or 280 pounds who wants him for his girlfriend, only that is going to scare these men into finding something in themselves shaped like a conscience. Only prosecuting George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Barack Obama and their partners in crime and bombing and torture will discourage future American war lovers from following in their bloody footsteps. Obama refuses to go after any of the Bush war criminals. He says repeatedly, this is his favorite phrase, we have to look forward, not backward. Have you heard that? Imagine a criminal standing in front of a judge in a courtroom saying, well, Your Honor, that was in the past. We have to look forward now. No one would be punished for any crime in the world if you follow this kind of logic. And yet Barack Obama, a former law professor, uses this expression again and again. What is wrong with the man? I think Barack Obama, I must say, is the worst thing that ever happened to the American left, ever. Even the Communist Party USA called for his re-election in 2012. God help us. in an earlier time, there would have been a name for someone like Obama. It would be Republican. We don't need a third party, we need a second party. And only the American people have the power, at least in theory, to get rid of such so-called leaders. And we who are activists need to educate the American people. That's not an easy job. There are many things standing in the way of reaching the American mind. Here are some of the problems you have to keep in mind. The lessons you have to impart to your fellow Americans. Lesson number 1 begins with a question. What does U.S. foreign policy have in common with Mae West? I'm glad you're all old enough to know who Mae West was. When I speak in colleges and I say to them, huh, Mae West? Mae West, the story goes, at the height of her fame, she had this beautiful mansion in Hollywood, and she had a visitor who came in and looked out around and said, "My goodness, what a beautiful home you have." And Mae West said, "Goodness has had nothing to do with it." Which is what I try to make Americans understand about our foreign policy. Goodness has nothing to do with it. That's the greatest myth surrounding our foreign policy, which makes it a very difficult task for people like us to reach the average American. They have this deeply held belief that no matter what we do abroad, no matter what harm we cause, and no matter how bad it may look, we do mean well. Our intentions are honorable, maybe even noble, and that is your main problem in dealing with the American mind. When they have this belief deeply in their consciousness or unconscious, you have a hard job to reach them. And these Americans genuinely wonder why the rest of the world can't see us the way these Americans see them. Frances Fitzgerald, whose name you may know, she wrote a marvelous book which was a study of the history textbooks used in American high schools. And she said in this book, quote, "According to these books, the United States had been a kind of Salvation Army to the rest of the world throughout history. It had done little but dispense benefits to poor, ignorant, and diseased countries. The United States always acted in a disinterested fashion, always from the highest of motives. It gave, it never took," unquote. And this is from high school textbooks. That's part of the reason that Americans have this closed mind and think that we mean well. And you have to look also at our comic books. Going way back, they impart the exact same message. We mean well. Our intentions are good. So that's lesson number 1 in reaching the American mind. Lesson number 2, the United States is not really concerned with this thing called democracy. No matter how many times any of our leaders will use that word when they speak in public, it would be difficult, in fact, to find a single brutal dictatorship of the second half of the 20th century that the United States did not support. Not just support, but put into power and keep in power against the wishes of their own people. As I mentioned, since 1945, the U.S. has attempted to overthrow more than 50 governments. The question is, what do American leaders mean when they use the word democracy so much? And we'll be hearing from them for a long time to come. One of the two brothers who carried out the bombing at the Boston Marathon in April, as you may have read, he was found hiding in this boat, and he had written on the inside of the boat before he was caught, quote, The U.S. government is killing our innocent civilians. I can't stand to see such evil go unpunished, unquote. Anti-American terrorists, like all terrorists, they have a keen sense of justice. You may not agree with their cause, but they are not just insane, mean bastards. They believe deeply in certain things, and the U.S. attacks upon their country just infuriate them. In my books, I give numerous examples of terrorists who have spoken out in this fashion against the U.S., specifying exactly what the U.S. had done that made them so angered at Washington. And these people are not lying. There's no reason to not believe them. You can regard terrorism as armed propaganda. This is a way of them spreading their message and hoping to win supporters. So there's no reason for them to be lying when they give American foreign policy as the reason behind their behavior. And it works the same way all over the world. From the not just in the Middle East, from the 1950s to the 1980s, the U.S. government and its foreign policy carried out numerous awful policies in Latin America. And what was the result of all those awful policies? Countless terrorist attacks upon U.S. embassies and diplomats and military personnel and U.S. bases, countless attacks during those decades, and all because of U.S. foreign policy again. Lesson number 4. The United States is not actually against terrorism per se. Only those terrorists who are not allies of the empire. At this very moment, in Florida, lives a man named Luis Posada Corrias. He's a part Venezuelan, part Cuban, who was one of the 2 masterminds behind the bombing of a Cuban airplane in 1973, which killed 76 people. And this man has lived in peace in Miami for decades, untouched by the U.S. government. Both Cuba and Venezuela have asked the U.S. to send him back to their homelands. They wanted him extradited. The U.S. has just ignored these pleas. So when they speak about asking the world to send Edward Snowden back home, you can think of the word hypocrisy. And Posada was just one of hundreds of anti-Castro terrorists living in Cuba who go unpunished or untouched by the U.S. government. And there are numerous others from Latin America and elsewhere living in Miami, guilty of the worst crimes. People from Guatemala and El Salvador and Indonesia, Haiti and elsewhere. All allies of the empire, at least at the time of their crimes. The United States has also fought on the same side as Islamic jihadists. How many Americans are aware of that? We have fought on the same side as jihadists in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Bosnia, Iran, Libya, and now Syria, including many with well-known connections to Al-Qaeda. Syria is the worst example, as I mentioned earlier when I spoke up. The Islamic fundamentalists in Syria are guilty of numerous suicide bombings and car bombings and beheading people, and at times with a plain kitchen knife they behead them, and they cut open their bodies. This is all on video. Go to YouTube. These people are proud of what they do. They're not ashamed. They have no idea that this is not what the rest of the world regards as civilized behavior. And these are our allies in Syria and elsewhere. And there's great pressure from Congress and the right wing to support these people. Isn't that amazing? These same people who speak out against terrorists all the time, they support such people. But they will not improve relations with Cuba. Cuba is just too terrible to have any relations with. And don't forget, the terrorists we supported in Libya turned around and killed our ambassador and 3 members of the CIA. It's also charming, isn't it? Ironically, under one of the many anti-terrorist laws enacted into law in the US in the recent years, under several of those laws, Barack Obama could be easily charged with giving aid to terrorism. And right now in prison in America, there are dozens of people charged with aiding terrorists, foreign terrorists. They're in jail for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and they have done much less than Barack Obama to aid terrorists. We're never reminded about our aid to all these terrorists, and we're never reminded that we put the Taliban into power in Afghanistan. And after we did that, Washington, our guest speaker also mentioned this, a part of it. Washington and the U.S. oil companies negotiated with the Taliban for years. The Taliban even said, this was under Clinton, Bill Clinton that is, the Taliban even sent people to Texas to talk to the U.S. oil companies. It was very close to a deal. For some reason, I'm not quite sure, the deal fell through. And the reason the U.S. was negotiating with the Taliban was because, as was mentioned before, they needed protection for the pipelines they wanted to build from Central Asia through Afghanistan to India and elsewhere. There was a danger of these pipelines being bombed, and that's why they needed the cooperation of the Taliban and their government. Most Muslims in the world regard U.S. foreign policy as being anti-Islam. I think this misreads Washington's intentions. The American empire is not anti-Muslim. It's anti only those who stand in the way of the empire's plan for world domination. The United States has had close relations with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, 3 prominent Islamic states in the Middle East. And in recent years, the U.S., as we know, has gone to great lengths to overthrow the 3 main secular governments in the Middle East: Libya, Iraq, and now Syria. Why are we overthrowing secular governments if we're so intent upon fighting Islam? All these things I mentioned, they make no sense if you accept at face value what we're told by our government. For many years, going back to the Korean War, it was also fashionable to say that the U.S. chose its bombing targets on the basis of people being third world or being Islamic. That too is a myth. Think of Yugoslavia in 1999. The U.S. carried out the greatest sustained bombing in its history, 78 days in a row against the poor people of Yugoslavia. And these people, who were these people? White, Christian Europeans. So you cannot say that our bombing aims simply at Muslims and people who support them. The only qualifications to qualify for being a bombing target of Washington, there are 2 qualifications. 1, the target poses a sufficient obstacle to something Washington wants to do. And 2, the target has little or no defense against aerial attack. Those are the 2 things which qualify a bombing target, which may save Iran because they may have sufficient protection against aerial attack. And that's what saves Korea, North Korea. Lesson number 5. Have some water. That's lesson number 5. Of the many lies surrounding the war in Iraq, the biggest one of all is that if in fact Iraq had these terrible weapons that we were told they had, if they hadn't, then somehow all the horror we've done would be justified, right? But that's nonsense. Because even if Iraq had 10 times the weapons that we said they had, Iraq had no reason to attack the US or Israel. None whatsoever, unless they were completely suicidal. But that's what it would have meant. Absolute suicide to bomb Israel or the US. American leaders themselves do not believe that Iraq possessed such weapons. This is well documented. Iraqi leaders went on major American television before the bombing began in 2003. They were on major shows. I forget their name, but Walter Cronkite and people like that. I had this all documented in my book. They went on major television shows and said explicitly, we have no such weapons and we are not planning any such weapons. And yet the US went ahead and bombed them. And you know, some people, I've heard American people in the media say, well, if they didn't have such weapons, why didn't they just tell us? I swear, that's what they say. Did they want us to bomb them? Why didn't they tell us? We would have stopped. Finally, lesson number 6 of the Cold War. There was never any such animal as the international communist conspiracy. There was, and still are, people living in misery in the third world who rose up against their oppressive governments, governments supported by Washington. Time and again during the Cold War, the US intervened to save these oppressive governments, even though the Soviet Union was not involved at all. Or the US overthrew a government simply because it was leaning towards socialism. Like Cuba, that's why we are still enemies of Cuba. They present a viable alternative to the capitalist system, and this is a sin we cannot forgive. 50 years of the most terrible sanctions and punishments. So the Cold War was not actually a conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. It was a conflict between the US and the third world. Although throughout these interventions, the US would kept telling the third world and telling the American people that they were intervening to stop Soviet expansion, to stop the international communist conspiracy. It is remarkable indeed that in the 21st century, the government of the United States is still going around dropping huge amounts of exceedingly powerful explosives on the heads of defenseless people. It wasn't supposed to be this way post-Cold War. In the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms instituted the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union and its police state. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and people all over Eastern Europe were joyfully celebrating a new day. The United States then joined in this celebration by invading and bombing Panama, just weeks after the Berlin Wall came down. Can you imagine that? What we thought of this great celebration going on? We just invaded some other country. When was the last time you were reminded of that by anyone in the media, or even on the left for that matter? At the same time we bombed Panama, we were busily busy intervening in the elections in Nicaragua. Soon thereafter, South Africa freed Nelson Mandela, and apartheid began to crumble. And before the year 1990 was over, Haiti held its first free election and nominated a genuine progressive, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. It seemed like anything was possible. Optimism was as widespread as pessimism is now. And then right after that, guess what happened? Bulgaria and Albania, quote, newly freed from the grip of communism, as our media would say, they chose to elect socialist governments. And the U.S. stepped in both cases and overthrew the government. I'm still amazed when I think of these things. In that same period, the U.S. was bombing Iraq for 40 consecutive days without mercy, for no good or honest reason. And that was that for our hope for a new and better world. That was the end of those marvelous thoughts. To sum up, the Cold War ended in 1991. The international communist conspiracy was no more red threat, and nothing changed in U.S. foreign policy. Since that time, the U.S. has been intervening and overthrowing governments just as often as during the Cold War. What does that tell you? It tells me that the so-called communist threat was just a ploy, an excuse for American imperialism. So, returning to lesson number 1, the most important one, about the U.S. meaning well. Don't ever look, if I were to write a book called The American Empire for Dummies, page 1 would say, don't ever look for the moral factor. U.S. foreign policy has no moral factor built into its DNA. Clear your mind of that baggage, which only gets in the way which only gets in the way of the cliches and the platitudes. They feed us all. It's a platitude and a cliche repeated for so many decades that very few Americans, even those on the left, would think that we didn't mean well through all those years of the Cold War, fighting the evil of communism. It would come as a shock to most Americans, even I'm sure many of you, that we couldn't care less about the so-called evil of communism. So that's part of the stone wall you have to deal with in trying to reach the American mind. And amongst the other kinds of miseducation you have to deal with, consider this: how we choose our leaders in the area of foreign policy. Like Secretary of State. In recent decades, in that position, we have found Alexander Haig, Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, and John Kerry, amongst others. So we've had men and women, blacks and whites, Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and so-called liberals. And the policy has been the same. Isn't that amazing? Has the policy concerning Israel varied enough amongst those people to be noticed? Who can name any difference in the policy towards Israel? Or the policy towards Cuba or Iran? What's the difference? Or towards Hugo Chavez while he was in power? Or Gaddafi of Libya? Or the use of NATO? What's the difference in policies amongst these varied secretaries of state? NATO, for example, has been surrounding Russia with the bases and missile sites ever since the Cold War ended. Regardless of who was in power in Washington, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Does anyone here have a map of the world? NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What are they doing in Afghanistan and Iraq? In fact, what are they doing in Europe? NATO was formed at the end of the Cold War with the clear understanding after the Soviet Union abolished the Warsaw Pact. NATO was promised to be abolished by the West, to match what the Soviet Union had done. But the Soviet Union no longer exists. The Russians abolished the Warsaw Pact. But Washington has found NATO to be a very valuable asset in carrying out its foreign policy. So NATO still exists, still looking for a purpose, a new purpose in life. It's a slogan used by people in NATO: out of area or out of business. Out of area means going to faraway places, not just Europe. Out of area or out of business, that's a common expression. So that's the issue of NATO, and yet when we have every few years a new candidate for Secretary of State, as one example, the American media discusses these various candidates with great seriousness, as if there's something to be chosen amongst them. Can Hillary Clinton win the confidence of key allies? How will Hegel expand Afrikaan? How will Kerry handle the Chinese? Burning questions in the American media, as if it makes one piece of difference which person is in the State Department. And the Sunday morning shows, talk shows, they discuss these questions with all these candidates with great seriousness. And the viewers think they're really watching, they're becoming very informed citizens on these Sunday morning shows. It's all a farce. If American leaders sincerely believe what they tell the world about U.S. foreign policy and about U.S. motives, it can be justly maintained that they are as fanatic as any Islamic fundamentalist. Can you argue with an Islamic fundamentalist about the morality of what he advocates? He'll insist that Allah is on his side, that you're Satan, and that you hate Islam. Can you argue with an American fundamentalist about U.S. foreign policy? He'll insist that the Lord is on their side, you're soft on terrorism, and you hate America. That's the way it goes. They're convinced that I hate America. Next time you're accused of hating America, say, what does that mean? Do I hate baseball? Do I hate American food? Do I hate every building in the country? What does it mean to say you hate America? You must point out, I hate American foreign policy, and that's where it begins and where it ends. USA Today reported a few months ago about a rebel fighter in Syria who told the newspaper in an interview, quote, "The afterlife is the only thing that matters to me, and I can only reach it by waging jihad," unquote. I would find it most interesting to be present the moment after this jihadist died and discovers that, much to his great shock, that there was no afterlife. Of course, to discover that there's no afterlife, there has to be an afterlife. On the other hand, a non-believer would likely be thrilled to find out that he was wrong. Let us hope that our dear leaders in Washington, our military leaders and State Department leaders and our corporate leaders who rule America, let us hope that they find out in this life that to put an end to anti-American terrorism, they're going to have to learn to live without unending war against the world. Let's hope they find out before the afterlife. we can say that the United States runs the world like the Taliban ran Afghanistan when they were in power. Cuba is dealt with like a woman caught outside without a burqa. Horrific sanctions are imposed on Iran in the manner of banning music, dancing, and kite flying in Kabul. Julian Assange, Bradley Manning, and Edward Snowden are banished from civilized society like the religious police whipping a man whose beard is not the right length. So our splendid leaders are seeking to put these brave young men in prison simply because they feel embarrassed. Our government leaders feel embarrassed by what these men have done, and that they're willing to put them away for life. There's not much you can find at fault with that, is there? And since Edward Snowden was in the news, Obama and Kerry and the mass media all repeat the same line. They say, well, all great powers spy. Why single out America for spying? To which I would reply, since we can find anti-Semitism in every country of the world, why do we single out Nazi Germany for condemnation? Obviously, the answer is that it's the magnitude of American aggression puts it in a league all by itself, the same as the magnitude of the Holocaust put Nazi Germany in a league all by itself. And that's no exaggeration. No one is even close to having done what we've done. And if you doubt what I'm saying, read my books, or just read my website. You don't have to buy my books.
No, buy his books.
Okay. That's my sales agent. I really worry about Assange and Manning and Snowden. The power of the empire to punish them scares me no end. No country is able to disobey Washington's command to impede the flight of the Bolivian president. That takes such great power to just cause all of Europe to clamp down on overflights. We now have offers from 3 nations in Latin America. And we'll see how they're punished for what they offer. It may well be that the NSA has a lot of dirt upon European leaders, and that's the reason they were able to make them toe the line. It's quite possible. I'm going to close now on some thoughts about the media, a subject which comes up frequently when you're discussing how to change U.S. foreign policy. Keep in mind this. There are more than 1,400 daily newspapers in the United States. How many of those 1,400 newspapers or television networks can you name that unequivocally oppose the war in Iraq? I've been asking this question for years, in person and in print. I've gotten one answer. Someone told me that the Seattle Post-Intelligencer unequivocally opposed the war. That's one example I've gotten so far out of thousands. And how many of these newspapers or TV networks unequivocally oppose our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Yugoslavia and Panama and Grenada and Vietnam? That's 7 wars. Can you even name 2 of them that opposed any of these wars? Can you name 1? It's just amazing when you think about it. And we attack Ecuador and Venezuela for not having an opposition media. Can you imagine? That's what we say. During the Cold War, a group of Russian writers were touring America, and they paid attention to the television and to the press. And they were amazed to find that almost all of the opinions on the vital issues they heard were the same. Quote, one of them said, quote, "In our country, to get that result, we have a dictatorship. We imprison people. Here, you don't have that. What is your secret?" I am asked occasionally why I'm so critical of the mass media when I quote from them to a great extent in my books. The answer is simple. The shortcomings of the mass media are errors of omission, much more than errors of commission, which is to say that they seldom tell out and out lies. It's what they leave out which distorts the stories again and again. So I can make good use of the facts they report. They have the money and the staff to uncover all kinds of facts which the alternative media cannot even come close to. So it's no wonder people like me will quote the mass media a lot, but we have no illusions about their honesty. If we measure the degree of brainwashing a population has about its government's policies, if we measure the gap between what the people believe about their government is doing and what the government is actually doing, by that measurement, the people of America are easily the most brainwashed in the world. They believe fervently in what we call American exceptionalism. And that's what those of us who are attempting to change the mindset of these people have to deal with. It's not an easy task we have, but you should know what you're up against and be prepared. I wish us all luck.
Children of the mafia to American citizens?
Oh, yeah.
Tell us that.
Yeah, it's like the children whose father is a mafia chieftain, and they have no idea what their father does for a living, and someone fires a shotgun through the window of their house, and they have no idea why anyone would do that, and it's a total confusion. They're living in complete ignorance of what their father does, and so many Americans, most of them, are living in complete ignorance of what their mafia government is doing, and why people are shooting shotguns through the windows of the State Department. What I've been denigrating is not the left, it's liberals. There's a big difference between a liberal and a radical, or between a liberal and a progressive. It's liberals I've been putting down, not the left.
So I get your left, so I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah.
And so we can be left if you're all right.
Well, forget the label for the moment. Just educate yourself and form opinions. And if you wind up on the left as a result of that, so be it. You don't start with being on the left and then look for the information. Then first educate yourself. Well, I don't know if it wasn't Costa, it might be anyone the U.S. and NATO approved is not going to be a progressive anyhow. And I'm glad you mentioned women in Afghanistan, and Kathy spoke about them. It's something which you don't hear very often. From the mid-1970s until the late 1980s, Afghanistan had a government which was very pro-women. Women were given education and all kinds of opportunities. They even wore miniskirts. It was fantastic, and don't take my word for it. There's a book published by the Pentagon, the same Pentagon, which published in 1986, which extols this government's treatment of women. And what happened to this government? the United States overthrew it. So next time you hear any American official speaking about we have to intervene in Afghanistan or we have to remain there for the sake of the women, tell them what I just said. It's just bullshit. Who knows what would have happened if we had not overthrown that government?
Self.
Well, the distinction between the corporations and the government is fading fast. There's a revolving door. It's the same people who head the corporations who then take high positions in the government, and then when that's over, they go back to the corporations. So I'm not sure we have to make a great distinction between those two institutions, the corporations and the White House and the State Department. It's all part of the same imperialism, to choose a single word. And we have to be aware of the harm done by both the corporations and the harm done by the government agencies, and fight them both. I'm not sure what else you're asking me. I mean, I agree with what you said, but we just have to make the public aware of both of them. I think by now, though, anyone on the left or the right, they're fully aware of the immense power of the corporations at home and abroad. We have made some inroads in our education. We don't have to start from scratch. There are many people in America much more cynical than in the past, and I think we people who share our views are much greater than you might imagine. Or even amongst those who oppose our views, they will concede the basic validity of our arguments. So things are not as bad as they look. We have to keep pushing it.
Are all the major media, major newspapers and TV under the control of ownership of only 4 or 5 corporations? 6?
I don't know. It's probably more. I don't know if it's 4 or 5, but it doesn't matter. They all survive through advertising, and because of advertising, they have to make the same kinds of compromises, and they all survive through nationalism. You can't operate a station and get advertisers and large amounts of listeners if you don't keep saying support our brave boys in Iraq. I mean, it's really overdone. I mean, I live in Washington, and the Washington Nationals baseball games, the announcers, almost every game, they'll speak about our brave boys, and then there'll be a marching band, and there'll be a helicopter above. We are becoming a military state. It's a really embarrassing, besides anything else. This love of the, and they call them all brave. Why is every soldier brave? I mean, why do they speak without any qualification? Our brave boys in Iraq. I hope I'm not.
They're all heroes.
Yeah, heroes, right. I hope I'm not. I just I forgot for the moment who I'm speaking to. I'm serious. I really had not thought about that at all. I hope I haven't offended anybody.
We are offended, Bill. Deeply offended.
Okay.
You talked a lot about the history of the U.S. Invading and toppling governments and whatever. Historically, what do you see in the future? Who do you see? What countries? What leaders do you see as targets in the near or not so near future?
Targets of the U.S.?
Yeah, in the future.
Well, it could be anybody who stands in the way of our policies. Before Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela, Venezuela was not regarded as a likely target of U.S. intervention or hostility. Who knows who? But now, of course, the most immediate planned targets are Iran and Syria. And of course, always Cuba. Cuba is one of my favorite subjects. I have a whole chapter, more than one chapter, on what the U.S. has done to Cuba. Cuba is not what you would think. I have a chapter in one of my new book called "Is Cuba a Dictatorship?" And my answer is no. And I go into great detail to examine that question. There is so much myth surrounding our foreign policy and what you're all taught. I'd have to write 10 more books to cover them all. What was it? Have I answered the question?
Hope you get those down. That'd be good.
What do you make of the huge demonstrations in Turkey and in Brazil, and perhaps in Egypt? I mean, there are apparently trivial issues like bus fares and things, but they're so huge.
Yeah, I don't like in Egypt. I'm confused. I don't know exactly what the masses of people hated about Morsi. I don't know exactly what the army hated about Morsi. I don't know why the army killed 60 people in one day. I should know, but the reports I get are not informative enough for me. Does anyone here have answers to any of those questions?
I've heard that part of Mubarak's plan, Mubarak people were behind Morsi's overthrow too.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. That probably is the case. They're very angry of what happened to their man. Yeah, I'm glad you said that.
They didn't accomplish anything while they did it. I mean, they didn't do anything.
Who?
They just served their own purpose. They didn't do anything for the people while they were in office.
Who are you speaking about?
The Muammar state.
Morsi.
Muslim brothers.
Yeah, but one can say this. He says Morsi didn't accomplish anything for the people. One can say that about any American president. You know, we don't.
That's what it was.
I must say, even though for all kinds of reasons I can share the people's hatred of such leaders, I'm bothered by the fact that a leader who came to power through apparently fair elections can be overthrown by the military so simply. That doesn't portend well for the future. No matter who's going to be a future leader in Egypt, they will be vulnerable to the same fate. It's not a good precedent.
Do you suspect that there's an Israeli connection in all this?
Yes, do I suspect there's an Israeli connection in all this? Most likely. It would be hard to imagine that there wasn't. They had an agreement with Mubarak. Well, the U.S. gave $1.5 billion of aid to Mubarak every year for the main purpose, apparently, of him promising not to attack Israel. $1.5 billion can buy an awful lot. And so Israel was probably in on this plan. And what the replacement for Mubarak or Morsi was going to do vis-a-vis Israel, I don't know. There are too many unknowns here. I really can't speak with great confidence and great knowledge.
Well, and I just wondered if you could comment on it. And then we bombed them. Instead of helping the starving people, we bombed them.
Well, I don't recall. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I don't recall him saying that was the reason.
That's what I heard.
I thought they bombed those shrines because there were symbols of the infidels.
Well, he had said that
That's
nobody was listening to him. Nobody was listening to the people of Afghanistan. They were starving. So his method, and we all know how people don't listen to these activists. So I mean, not that he wasn't.
I'm skeptical that he said that.
Well,
Just
But
I
point
don't
of
know who said it,
clarification,
but I heard it.
Osama Bin Laden was not from Afghanistan. He was from Saudi Arabia.
yeah.
He was in
And that was,
Afghanistan.
he was in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole separate story. Why do we bomb Afghanistan?
Anyway, I thought you would comment, but never.
No, I don't think the story is valid, is real. So I really can't comment much. If I have to choose if I had to guess to explain what happened, I would choose. I think it's more likely that the U.S. Powers that be got the wind of the planned attack on the towers, and they decided to make use of it, and they let it happen as opposed to making it happen. They probably, if this is correct, I would guess they thought when they got wind of this plot, they assumed there was going to be some old-fashioned type plane hijacking with the hijackers make certain demands, and so they could live with that, and so they allowed it to go through, and hoping to make use of that. And what happened, of course, gave them even more excuse to make use of than anything they could have had in mind. So that's just one theory. There's the theory that that it was an inside job. There's the theory I just mentioned that they let it happen, and there are other theories. And I've been attacked for countless times for not accepting fully the inside job theory. Even once when I was speaking, someone came on stage to yell at me. It's a very sensitive subject, and it has its fanatics. For each of these theories, each of these points of views, there's a whole movement in support of that theory. And I get emails all the time attacking me because I haven't yet come out in favor of the inside job theory. And I tell these people, I support your endeavors to prove that it was an inside job, because if you can prove that the U.S. powers that be were behind 9/11, you will do more to end the empire than anything I have ever written. And that's what I tell them, and I'm quite sincere. So I'm not opposed to their looking for that theory, looking for the inside job. I wish them luck. I hope they can find that.
$80 billion
Yeah.
NSA spying.
Yeah, listen, there is no question that the U.S. powers that be have made full use of 9/11 in terms of the military, in terms of the defense budget, in terms of foreign policy. They have made full use of it, which certainly gives some weight to the argument in favor of an inside job. And I'm not saying they're wrong. I just have not yet fully subscribed to the inside job. And you know what? Here's what I tell them. I should mention this. To these folks, these inside job people who contact me and ball me out, I say, if you want me to believe what you're saying about the inside job, then give me an idea of what actually happened. What happened with the planes? Who were piloting those planes? What happened to the passengers? If you can tell me halfway decently what actually happened, then I'd be more prepared to believe your ideas about inside job. But they can never tell me anything, except some of them will come up with some wild, crazy scheme, like the planes were remote controlled, you know. So that's the reason I have not yet fully joined the inside job faction.
It doesn't matter whether it's an inside job or it was allowed to happen. It still indicts the U.S. in the greatest crime in history by a single terrorist act.
Either way, yeah, an inside job or let it happen would serve the purpose that I said before. It would condemn U.S. foreign policy and the powers that be much more than anything I could ever write. But I think you'll agree, of those two things, the inside job would carry even more weight than let it happen. I mean, if they knew that Bush and Cheney actually planned this to happen, all hell would break out. My God, it would be insane.
Maybe not.
Right. That's happened. I lived in Chile when Salvador Allende was in power, and the right wing, who was desperate to get him out of power, they instigated countrywide shortages, one after another. stores were suddenly out of toilet paper and cigarettes, and the expression of the day, if you know Spanish, was "no hay." There is none. No hay. That was once then the Yente government did expose places where they were hoarding the toilet paper and so on, and one could buy cigarettes on the black market with no problem in the street. So there was not a shortage of cigarettes either, but the stores were short of it. So this is a very common thing, and it's carried out by conservatives, and they know how to do it very well.
I think I've heard it's carried out by the army in Egypt. We give the money to the army.
Oh yeah, the army in Egypt is unlike other armies. They are greatly involved in the economy. They own huge amounts of businesses, millions and millions of dollars. So they would be in a better position even.
I have some personal experience.
You mean now?
Yeah, now.
Oh, I don't.
Who are the journalists that the CIA is writing for?
Oh, I don't know now. I don't. I'd be surprised if they're still doing that. That was something very, very common in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, or maybe in the 80s a bit. I suspect they've gone beyond that. Although I can see why it would still come in handy. They want to. I can see where they would have used it in. Well, I was about to say in Venezuela, but they didn't have to. In Venezuela, had its own opposition press, which hated Chavez. They didn't need the CIA coming in to write articles to appear in Venezuela. It was done by the conservatives quite normally. So I don't think as much now. Someone who hasn't asked a question?
The United States
Yeah.
helped create the CIA.
Yeah, there's a book called Paperclip. It's a whole book on that very subject. There's so many things that the average American is totally unaware of. You know, this thing with they hired all Nazis and Japanese torturers to teach them methods of torture. So many things like that. And here's something very few of you probably know about. In 1946, when the war had just ended, there was a great uprising of American GIs all over because the U.S. government wanted to send these GIs not home to be demobilized. They wanted to send them to various countries to help put down left-wing movements, like in the Philippines and in China. And this was a major movement. Tens of thousands of GIs rose up all over. And how many people here ever heard of that? To fight for them against the Serbs, for example, or the Croats.
Sounds familiar.
Yes, it sounds like Syria and Libya. As I mentioned before, I gave a list of the nations, the jihadist nations that we have supported in our foreign policy. And I named Afghanistan, and Bosnia, and Kosovo, and Libya, and Syria. There's at least 5, maybe I missed one. So that's the way it goes. And now I'm exhausted.